Welcome to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series, brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. My name is Steve Damaris, and I'm the Taylor Chair in Applied Big Game Research and Instruction at Mississippi State University. Thanks for joining me. Now let's look at some of the breeding ecology that we've discovered here at the MSU Deer Lab using DNA analytical methods. I already talked about Jason Sumner's. Now I want to talk about breeding success. Randy was one of our PhD students here at the MSU Deer Lab. He went on and is now wildlife population geneticist at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University in Kingsville. And so what I'm going to summarize here is some of the research that he did during his PhD and also subsequently conducted at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute in South Texas. Elk, bulls isolate and collect a harem of females that they control access to, and when a female cow comes into estrus within his harem, he's going to breed her, and he's going to keep his harem until another bull comes in and usurps his control of that harem. Well, whitetails don't have a harem. They don't have a defended territory. They have something called a tending bond. And a whitetail buck is going to move across his home range during the breeding season. He's prepared, and he is out looking for an opportunity. And so he's looking for a doe that is in standing estrus, and while she's in estrus, he's going to tend her. And this tending bond is between a buck and a doe, and this buck is going to stay with the doe through estrus or until he gets run off by another buck. And we've had cases where two older bucks are actually fighting, and a younger buck will actually slip in and breed the doe while the two more dominant bucks are fighting for dominance and to control that access to that doe. So we know that a given doe will stand for more than one buck while she's in standing estrus. So this leads to the interesting question of which bucks are actually doing the breeding. Earlier behavioral research that was based not on genetics and DNA analysis, but on observations of deer in the wild, just behavioral observations. What can you see during the daytime? Those early research projects suggested that a few dominant, older, larger antlered bucks controlled access to the does and did most of the breeding. Does were tended by a dominant buck, and only a few dominant bucks controlled access to the breeding does. Well, once we started looking at genetic analysis, we learned that, well, it's a little more complicated than that. So we did a lot of breeding research in our deer research pens with Randy DeYoung, and we looked at breeding success in 6 different sets of pens with 2 to 3 bucks in each set of pens with a set of does. So the dominant male produced most of the offspring, but subordinates did produce offspring in 5 out of the 6 trials. So what Randy learned was, yes, the dominant male does most of the breeding, but that dominance hierarchy is not stable throughout the breeding season. And even where it was stable, there was a frequent occurrence of multiple paternity. And we were actually the first scientists to document multiple paternity in white-tailed deer. And this is the case where 2 sires produced fawns within a litter. So twin fawns, 2 different daddies. And this happened in 24% of the cases in our research pens. And we thought, well, that's probably abnormally high because this is research pens. And we did some additional analyses that, these bucks did not have their antlers on generally when they were doing the breeding. And Dr. Phil Jones, who also got his PhD here at the MSU Deer Lab, he showed in his analysis that body mass explained only about 50% of the variation in breeding success. So these bucks did not have their antlers. They weren't able to fight with their antlers. They had to determine who was dominant based on things other than their antlers. And body mass explained about 50% of that breeding success, but attitude appeared to be really important as well. an attitude in terms of persistence and how hard they wanted to fight for access to that doe. It's interesting now to look at wild breeding success, and this is a long-term study that we did in cooperation with the Noble Foundation, Ken G. and Bob Gonzalez with the Noble Foundation, Rodney Honeycutt, who was at Texas A&M University, and Randy DeYoung, who was again working on his PhD with us. A lot of this data was collected in Oklahoma, some of it was collected in Mississippi, and some of it was collected in Texas. One of his questions was, if you have a 6-month-old fawn, who produced that fawn? The recruitment of the fawn into the population is really what's critical, and we did a lot of DNA sampling, particularly Ken G. Over about a 10-year period. He was out capturing fawns on the Noble Foundation study area in Oklahoma. And we also looked for antler sheds, and in the far right picture shows a skull of a buck that was found on the property. That we ended up sampling about 50% of the entire population in Oklahoma. This was a fenced population, a 3,000 acre property. 3,000 acres is a lot of area. There were genetic samples from 502 unique deer over the 10-year period, and Randy was able to get DNA from 312 6-month-old fawns and was able to assign paternity to 154 of these fawns. And so we had a really excellent sample of breeding behavior and breeding success in this particular study area. First off, how many bucks were breeding? And Randy showed that 1/3 of adult bucks contributed to the production of at least one 6-month-old fawn. 61 out of 179 potential sires produced at least one fawn. So a lot of the bucks are breeding. It's not just a few of the dominant bucks. 1/3 of the adult bucks were involved in producing at least one fawn. Now, what are the characteristics of the bucks that did produce those fawns? Here's an example of a buck. Now, you look at the photos of the two antlers and you say, well, those are two different deer. Well, Randy has genetic proof that they are not two different deer. The photo on the left is a set of antlers that were recovered from the property, and we didn't know how old this buck was, but we estimate that he was at least 3 years of age, and his skull was recovered 3 years after the first set of antlers were recovered. And so we know that he produced 9 fawns. The year he was at least 3 years of age, he produced 3 fawns. The next year he was at least 4 years of age, he produced 4 fawns. And the year after that he was at least 5 years of age and he produced 2 fawns. The year he died, he did not produce any fawns. This is a great story here from this one example. It shows how antler conformation, or the shape of the antlers, can change late in the life of the buck. And we also showed a buck that had some really large antlers that was very successful at producing fawns. Now, we sampled 50% of the fawn population, and so this particular buck could have produced twice as many fawns, could have produced 18 fawns, but minimally he produced 9 fawns that we know about. Here's another example of a buck that Ken was actually able to capture as a 1-year-old buck, and he removed the antlers. We found his antlers at 3 years of age. His antlers were found at 4 years of age. He produced 5 fawns when he was a 5-year-old and 3 fawns when he was a 6-year-old. Now you notice this guy doesn't have huge antlers at 3 and 4 years of age. We don't know what he had at 5 and 6 years of age because we didn't recover his antlers, but we did document he bred as a 5 and 6-year-old. We had no proof that he bred as a 1, 2, 3, or 4-year-old. This guy, he was very successful for a couple of years and probably burned himself out during those couple of years. He may have died after 6 years of age. We don't know what happened to him. This guy, pretty good antler size, and he was around for quite a few years. When he was a yearling, he was successful at producing 1 fawn. When he was a 2-year-old, he produced 3 fawns. As a 3-year-old, 2 fawns. 4-year-old, 2 fawns. 5-year-old, 2 fawns. 6-year-olds, 2 fawns. 7-year-old, 2 fawns. This guy produced 14 fawns over a 7-year period, and I like to call him Mr. Consistency. He had some pretty good antlers. We don't know what his antlers were each year, but he was very consistent, in contrast to the flash in the pan buck that contributed to the gene pool only during 2 years. So there's different behaviors here by different bucks. The aggressive flash in the pan versus this guy that was Mr. Consistency. Another buck that as a yearling he produced a fawn. He did not produce a fawn that we were able to sample at 2 years of age, produced 2 at 3, 1 at 4, 1 at 5. Not a big antlered buck. So, do big antlers guarantee breeding success? Not necessarily. If you look at the lower right hand picture, here's a buck that died as a 4-year-old with a really big set of antlers. We have no proof that he ever produced a fawn. The lower left-hand photo, pretty good set of antlers. No proof that he produced fawns. The upper right-hand photo, harvested as a 3-year-old on the property. He was there as a 2-year-old. He did not produce any fawns. So there's not a consistent pattern in antler size as being the primary determinant. And we also showed in our research facility that body size contributed 50% to the breeding success. So we have body size being important, antler size should be important, attitude is probably important. Throughout the lifetime of the buck, 60% of the successful bucks produced a single fawn over their lifetime. 10% produced 2 fawns over their lifetime. 5 or so percent produced 3 fawns, 4 fawns, 5 fawns, 6, 7 fawns. An individual buck over their lifetime is not going to produce a lot of fawns. Let me repeat that. An individual buck over his lifetime is not going to produce a lot of fawns. If you have a buck on your property and you think you're going to save him so he can produce the big bunch of fawns on your property over the next 3 or 4 years, think again. He may produce quite a few fawns for you, but most bucks are not highly successful at producing a lot over their lifetime. Most bucks maybe get to breed 1 or 2 does over their life and produce 1 or 2 fawns. This was on a single study area that we sampled very intensively in cooperation with Ken G at the Noble Foundation. We also looked at 3 properties, and one of these 3 properties is the Noble Wildlife Unit in Oklahoma, that are tied back to different harvest strategies. The harvest strategy is an approach to buck management that affects sex ratio and age structure. So we looked at a national wildlife refuge in Mississippi, Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge, which we termed male exploited. Pretty much any buck with hardened antlers could be harvested as long as they met minimum antler size criteria. 80% of the harvest was made up of 1.5 or 2.5-year-old bucks. So there was not a lot of age structure, not many older age bucks in this population. That's why we call it male exploited. And the sex ratio at Noxubee, by the time breeding took place, it was way unbalanced. 1 male and at least 7 females were available to breeding. And if you remember earlier, that can result in missed estresses, delayed breeding. There was a lot of late breeding taking place on Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge at that time. We have the Noble unit, which we referred to as a quality deer management. In this case, harvest was limited to about 1 male per 1,000 acres, and they had to be 2 years or older. And there were some older bucks on the property, and if you remember seeing some antlers of some older bucks, but this was an attempt at quality deer management. Quality deer management had a sex ratio at breeding about 1 male to 2.5 females. And then the King Ranch practices trophy management in South Texas. They harvested less than 1 buck per 1,000 acres and only harvested bucks that were 4 years of age or older. And so they had about the same sex ratio as the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma, but they had a much older age structure. So we looked at breeding success as affected by sex ratio and age structure. And let's see what we learned about the Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge. The light green histogram shows the percentage of the population represented by that age class. So in this particular case, about 65% of the population were yearlings, about 15% of the population were 2-year-olds, and about 20% of the buck population was 3 years of age or older. Looking at the breeding success, who is actually doing the breeding, we see that about 1/3 of the breeding was done by yearlings, 1/3 was done by 2-year-olds, and 1/3 by 3.5 and older. Let's look at breeding success at the Noble Foundation unit in Oklahoma. Where you have this quality deer management approach, you have a much greater success rate of older bucks being successful breeders. So in this particular management scenario, a lot of older bucks are doing the majority of breeding. However, even in the quality deer management scenario, 10% of yearling bucks were breeding and 20% of the 2-year-old bucks were breeding. So young bucks are still going to be breeding in a wild population under quality deer management. Now let's look at the trophy buck management, and here we see a greater percentage made up of 3.5 and older bucks because of the very restrictive trophy buck management. If it wasn't 4 years of age or older, you couldn't shoot it. But you don't see a lot of difference in the success rate of bucks in this population compared to the quality deer management. 70% of the breeding is done by 3-year-old or older, 15% by 2-year-olds, and about 15% by yearlings. So even in the King Ranch property, where almost 60% of the bucks were older bucks, you still had about a 30% of the breeding being done by 1 and 2-year-old bucks. And if you jump back to the Noble unit, we had 30% of the breeding being done by 1 and 2-year-old bucks. So it's young bucks are going to get their chance to breed even if you have a lot of older bucks. And part of it has to do with that tending bond breeding strategy of white-tailed deer. Randy was able to look at the age structure and tie that back to the timing of conception. And the median or peak breeding is actually December 9th on the King Ranch. And you see that the younger bucks, particularly the yearlings, are much more successful during the peak of breeding, when the majority of the does were coming into estrus. And when there's a lot of does coming into estrus during the peak of breeding, there's more opportunity for younger bucks to be successful breeders. And then if you look way out in January into January, the conception dates there, they're only by 1 and 2-year-old bucks. Second estrus, and I think in this particular case all the older bucks were worn out from the main breeding season, and then come January they were recovering from what they went through during the peak of breeding. And that allowed the younger bucks that hadn't invested as much in breeding activity to go ahead and grab those does later in the season. And back to that multiple paternity, we've been able to look at 6 different populations across the southeast, and it's not just the research facility where we had the controlled breeding. 25%, roughly 1 in 4 sets of twins or triplets are going to be sired by different bucks. So multiple paternity is a common feature in wild deer populations across the southeast. Back to that pesky question of antler size and breeding success. Some more analysis that Dr. DeYoung did at Texas A&M Kingsville at the Kleberg Institute, looking at breeding success and age structure. And you look within each age class, the successful breeders had no bigger antlers than the average for that age class within the population. So this graph shows that successful breeders are not bigger than average antlered bucks. So when it comes to breeding success, Dr. DeYoung and his work here and continuing work at Kingsville has shown, really developed a new paradigm. Older bucks certainly are more successful, but 30% of the breeding is going to be done by 1 and 2 year old bucks. And we've learned that antler size and body size do not explain all of the within age class variation. You have bigger body, you have bigger antlers. That's not going to guarantee your opportunity for breeding. Many different bucks are going to be doing the breeding, and that's because does live in small groups. They're scattered across these doe family units. Bucks chase an individual doe. Most does are going to be bred within a 2 to 4 week period. When it comes down to dominance, dominance is important, but it's dominance around a given estrus doe. You don't have to be the most dominant buck on a property. You just have to be the most dominant buck that finds an individual doe. And even then, you might have a yearling or a 2 year old buck slip in while you're fighting another potentially dominant buck and have a yearling breed that doe. So dominance is important. Antler size is important to dominance, but it's not a guarantee. So the management implications of Dr. DeYoung's work, kind of good news, bad news. Good news is you can shoot whatever buck you want on your property, and it's not going to mess up the genetics of your population. The bad news is you cannot improve the genetics of your population by shooting smaller antlered bucks and leaving the bigger antlered bucks to do the breeding, because they're not going to be able to do the majority of breeding. So white-tailed deer, a lot of bucks doing the breeding, variety of age classes, and that's some of the interesting results of our genetics research here at the MSU Deer Lab and at the Kleberg Institute. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about the reproductive ecology of white-tailed deer today. I hope I've given you a better appreciation of the control of reproduction and understanding how female breeding dates are regulated and how we can sometimes change a population's breeding dates through management, but they are actually relatively stable, and that stability is usually timed towards adaptation to long-term environmental characteristics or climate. If you've enjoyed this presentation and think it was worthwhile, I hope you'll share it with your friends. You can also go to the msudeerlab.com website and learn more about a variety of topics. You can listen to our Deer University podcast, and we also have several smartphone apps that you can download to help you with your deer management programs. Have a great day.